Welcome back, everybody, to The Great Dictators. We're looking at Adolf Hitler. This is part two. And up till now, we've looked at the formulative period in Hitler's life, his adolescence and his youth. And he's a young man when we see that on the brink of being essentially left behind as a derelict wandering between Austria and Germany. He finds himself in Munich when the First World War breaks out. And as Hitler will himself recount, this event will revitalize him. It will make him who he is. The best book, and a very recent book by Thomas Weber on Hitler's military service, exploring the various myths and realities, is a book called Hitler's First War. I highly recommend it if you want to look deeper into that period of his life, which of course is going to be so important later to his reputation and to his politics. Hitler will, putting aside all later Nazi propaganda, Hitler will have a distinguished military career. We have to grant him that. He will be awarded the Iron Cross second class very early in the war, October 1914, in the first months of the war, at the Battle of Ypres. His regiment, the List regiment from Bavaria, is essentially wiped out by the Battle of Ypres, from 3,500 men reduced to 600. Hitler will be one of the few survivors of that initial first period of the war. It's, of course, I don't think I need to describe to anyone the intensity of this war. Most of World War I casualties are caused by big artillery, big guns. And Hitler is finding himself relentlessly under Allied bombardment through these early war battles. And Hitler very quickly becomes a regimental courier. His job essentially is to run messages, and he'll be promoted to corporal. And it's a very dangerous job, running messages through fire. This is, of course, still before radio is easily deployed. And of course, all that artillery bombardment prevents cabling communications. So you need a human runner to run through the battlefield under fire and deliver messages. And that's what Hitler is quite courageously doing. He has time to continue with his artwork. And in fact, for those of you who are Hitler art collectors, you know that his World War II watercolors are the ones that are most prized. Although they do look kind of juvenile, it's almost like the kind of art boys do in public school. And once again, you see the kind of crude human figures in his art. But architecturally, they're in terms of perspective and so forth, they're quite skilled. Hitler um, is remembered by his fellow soldiers um, relatively fondly. He is not really the center of attention. He is not exactly a loner either. His fellow soldiers remember him as a reliable comrade. Many of his friendships from the First World War will endure throughout his dictatorship in Germany. He will promote some of his fellow soldiers to high positions. This is a picture that, along with the picture of his mother, is also on his desk when he dies. And the only regret that Hitler apparently voices, or kind of a condolence for losses, is not for the men of his regiment, but actually for that dog that you see in the picture. And this was Hitler's dog, and at one point, a passing regiment on the march sees the dog and thinks that the dog is homeless, and they'll take the dog away with them. And Hitler, for the rest of his life, mourns the loss of his dog rather than his comrades in battle, which tells us something about Hitler. Hitler will be wounded by shrapnel in 1916. He ends up surviving some 15 battles, apocalyptic World War I battles. I have quite a lot of photographs of Hitler from the First World War. Here, I think you can see he's next to kind of an improvised orchestra. You can see they have like pots and pans for kind of percussion, and Hitler is not in the middle, but he is within the group, right at the edge on the left side of the image. And I think very much this photograph is symbolic of his relationship with his army comrades. As I say, he's not the star of the regiment, but he's not the reject either. He is there. Hitler will as well earn an Iron Cross First Class in August of 1918, near the end of the war. And it's a rare award for a enlisted man, for a non-commissioned officer. The first class, usually that was reserved for, as I say, officers in the German army in the First World War, but Hitler earns it just the same. We're not quite clear exactly what was his act. The Iron Cross First Class is for conspicuous gallantry under fire. Certainly, Hitler repeatedly showed conspicuous gallantry as a courier. There is a suggestion that as far as lower ranking German soldiers, those who served in a kind of a headquarters position, which certainly Hitler did. He wasn't in the trenches constantly. He would be running between different trenches, so he did have kind of connections with higher ranking command staffs where possibly he could have lobbied for that Iron Cross First Class. There are accounts as well, although they come later, during the Nazi regime, that Hitler had personally captured either French or British soldiers single-handedly. Although, when we do look in the historical record, it's actually Hitler's superior officer who is mentioned in dispatches as capturing this group of French officers or French soldiers in the case of the account. It's unclear. Hitler's superior officer is an officer by the name of Gutmann, who happens to be Jewish. And again, later in Nazi propaganda, there's kind of discussions of Hitler's attitude towards his Jewish superior, and Hitler's quoted saying, well, I have no respect for a Jew, but I have respect for him as an officer. That, of course, I think is post-war, later in Nazi propaganda. But Gutmann is the one who would have to recommend Hitler for this award, and it is genuine. He is awarded the Iron Cross First Class. It is a rare award, and it's not something that later is, by the Nazis kind of back issued to him. It's a genuine award, and Hitler will see in his personal appearance, he has none of that kind of, Gaddafi, Idi Amin flair for a uniform with 1,000 medals on it. It's very simple. He'll have this military tunic with his party armband, and there'll be only 3 awards that actually 2 military awards that he'll wear on it, and you can see you have on top, Hitler has his gold party badge. This is a Nazi member of the Nazi party badge, but it's surrounded by a gold wreath, which means that he is among the first 100,000 members of the party. A few are issued as well as kind of ceremonial honorary gold awards for prominent Nazis, but essentially the first 100,000 do get this gold party badge. Each one is numbered with their party number. These are very collectible because, of course, with the party number stamped on the back, you can see this is party number 30,153. Collectors can actually track down a party number. They're all cataloged and find out, to whom this particular badge actually belongs. So it's not an anonymous badge. So, that he wears, and this is the gold party badge that he will, on the last day of his life, take from his tunic and give it to Magda Goebbels as a token of his affection, a kind of a parting gift on the eve of his suicide. Then there's the Iron Cross First Class that he wears pinned to his tunic beneath the party badge, and then the wound badge that he received, and he'll be actually wounded twice, but I'm not sure if he received the wound badge for the first wounding of shrapnel. This is a kind of a third class badge. They would go from dark to silver to gold, depending upon how severe your wounds are and how many you received. And so he has the lower ranking wound badge. And those will be, as I say, in kind of his appearing of simplicity, the only awards that this Hitler will wear. In September 29th, 1918, the final campaign is going to take place on the Hindenburg Line. The Americans have now entered the war, and the Hindenburg Line essentially collapses under this Allied attack, and it's the beginning of the end. And October 13th, 1918, Hitler is wounded in a British gas attack. He ends up hospitalized and apparently blind. And it's unclear how Hitler was temporarily blinded. We're not even sure what kind of gas he was exposed to, whether it was mustard or chlorine gas. They had different effects. And there are suggestions as well, and more than suggestions, hypotheses quite well argued out that the nature of Hitler's blindness was entirely psychological. It was a kind of shell shock, traumatic blindness. In any regards, Hitler will now spend the remaining weeks of the war in a hospital off the battlefield. And, perhaps often psychology does work that way. Men often tend to desert or break down near the end of a campaign, especially if they have, tested their courage numerous times, have survived, and, the end is near. The pressure often is on to survive those last weeks, not to be among the last casualties of the war. And so perhaps that may be, partly the reason behind Hitler's, quote, hysterical blindness. What is happening in Germany, of course, at that moment, as Hitler is in the hospital, is Germany is collapsing from the inside. Soldiers are beginning to desert the front lines and are just come home. It's not exactly a mutiny, but the German politicians who as well had supported the Kaiser in the war now are questioning the war, threatening to withdraw funding. That's one power that the Reichstag, the German parliament, has. And the Kaiser, Germany has kind of a constitutional monarchy with a Kaiser, the bastardization of the word Caesar, Kaiser. But the Kaiser has more power than, say, in Britain. But the one thing the Reichstag can do is withdraw allocations from the national budget to the war effort. And that's exactly what now politicians, as everything goes into chaos, there's, of course, a blockade of Germany. People are literally starving in Germany at home. And so things begin to collapse from the inside. Paul von Hindenburg, Erich Ludendorff, and the Kaiser quit. Paul von Hindenburg, of course, was the commander-in-chief of the German army. Erich Ludendorff was the chief of staff. And we'll see that both of these individuals will actually have quite a role later to play in Hitler's rise to power. And so the Kaiser abdicates and leaves Germany. He's given shelter in Holland by the Dutch royal family, and he'll remain living in exile in Holland right up to the point where the Nazis invade the Netherlands and occupy it. I think he dies in 1940 or 41, if I'm not mistaken. Hindenburg and Ludendorff just throw up their hands and say, we quit. And they too go into at first exile because they're afraid that they're going to be charged with war crimes and put on trial by the Allies, and that will not happen. Eventually, they'll make their way back to uh, Germany, but they just throw up their hands, as they say, and tell the politicians, "You finish the war." And so in November, on November 9th, 1918, the Second Reich, Imperial Germany, collapses. And there is a new republic that now comes to power. And all this, Hitler is just hearing about while he's in the hospital. Presumably, if he's blind, he's not reading newspapers. So he's just getting news, and Hitler will describe in Mein Kampf how he breaks down weeping when he gets the news of the armistice that the Germans are going to sign with the Allies. The new provisional government is led by Friedrich Ebert, a member of a large, middle of the road political party in Germany, the Social Democratic Party. It's one of the oldest parties in Germany. And so they will form the first provisional government. Ebert, of course, is very concerned about the scenario that is unfolding in Germany because of what happened in Russia. Russia, too, in a very similar way, collapsed under the kind of mismanagement, disastrous mismanagement of the Tsar and in the imperial government at that time in Russia. And eventually, in 1917, in February, there is a very popular revolution, one that the Bolsheviks actually sit out. Most of them, like Lenin, are in exile. Lenin is in Switzerland at that moment. Trotsky is in New York City. So it's all the other parties that rise up and essentially force Tsar Nicholas I to abdicate in February. And they set up a Republican provisional government, very much in the same way that a year later the Germans set up theirs. What, of course, Ebert fears now is what happened next in Russia. The German intelligence at that point wants to get Russia out of the war, and so they facilitate the return of Lenin from exile from Switzerland. They help Lenin take a train from Switzerland through Germany into Denmark, the famous SEAL train that he's not allowed to get off at until he gets to St. Petersburg. And this train, as I say, goes all the way up to Denmark and then takes a ferry to Finland, and then through Finland he'll arrive in Russia, and he will now ferment mutiny among soldiers in the various Soviets, which are Soviet means councils, which is the way the Republican Kerensky government had set up the provisional government. And the problem, of course, is that Kerensky was committed to keeping Russia in the First World War. Lenin was very much intending to take Russia out of the war. Why, according to Lenin's position, why should Russian workers be killing German workers? Workers of the world, throw off your chains, unite. That's the slogan of the Communist Party. And so Lenin, these Russian soldiers don't want to go back to the disastrous front, as the provisional government is no more efficient in prosecuting the war further. And so Lenin now foments this coup d'etat. The storming of the Winter Palace is kind of a myth. There is no storming, as you could see in this Soviet propaganda image, it's basically a coup d'état that occurs in October of 1917, or November by our calendar, and this becomes known as the Russian Revolution, or the Red Revolution, Red October. But of course, it's not a revolution at all in the way the first one was in February. What happens? It's a coup d'état, essentially. Sailors from the Kronstadt base near St. Petersburg will kick in the doors of the palace and the cabinet meeting, and they'll throw the provisional government politicians out into the street and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, which will now endure until 1991, and is still a dictatorship, I guess, under Putin. Maybe not of the proletariat, a dictatorship, I guess, of the oligarchs now. So this is a very viable scenario for what might happen next in Germany, and Friedrich Ebert is very concerned that history does not repeat itself in Germany. And so the first thing that Ebert does is he immediately reestablishes relationship with the German military, unlike the provisional government in Russia really didn't do a good job of it. He ensures that the German aristocracy, particularly the military castes on the German general staff, all the ones that have VON in their name, which is in German pronounced von, von Rundstedt, von Manstein. It's an aristocratic title. The VON, it means of Manstein or of Rundstedt. He ensures that the so-called Junkers remain in their privileged position in the new Germany, in the Republican Germany, which will eventually take on the name of the Weimar Republic. We'll get to that in a second. And so the other thing that Ebert does, of course, is he holds a huge parade after the end of the war. It's almost like a victory parade. The German army is welcomed into Berlin on the day after the armistice, as if they had won the war. And in fact, technically, the Germans had not lost the war. November 11th, 1918, the 11th day of the 11th month, the 11th hour, when we commemorate remembrance, is not a defeat. It's not a surrender. This is an armistice. It's a temporary truce to work out a final settlement. Germany is not occupied in the way that it will be after the Second World War. Germany is not destroyed at all. In fact, no battles were fought on the territory of Germany. It's of course France and Belgium, and as well as the Dardanelles and Gallipoli in Turkey, in Palestine, where the fighting took place. But Germany essentially remained pristine. No combat there, while, of course, France and Belgium took the brunt of this destruction. And so the German army marches back in pride, and Ebert and the Republic is going to depend on the German army to maintain order in what is now becoming revolutionary Germany. And this, of course, sparks an uprising from left-wing factions who blame the Junkers and the German military establishment for the disaster that they had brought on Germany. And so civil war now breaks out in Germany between left and right. And so there's going to be almost a year of this kind of chaos. Already under the terms of the armistice, the German army is reduced to 100,000 men, no more. And the Allies, who also fear Bolshevism, communism, are becoming actually concerned that perhaps they limited the German army to too small of a force, considering how popular the uprisings are that are occurring inside of Germany. And so the Allies look the other way as the Ministry of Defense and various private parties who are afraid that their property is going to be seized by German communists now fund the Freikorps or the Free Corps. And these are kind of paramilitary anti-communist forces, and many of them will become later the kind of seeds of the stormtroopers of Hitler's paramilitary that he will deploy into the streets of Germany. Some of them, some Freikorps units, will come over to the Nazis in Ho. But at this moment, the Freikorps is essentially this kind of coalition of various right-wing parties opposed to communism and ensuring that communist revolutions that are taking place in various provinces of Germany or states. Germany, by its nature, is similar to the United States in many ways, where German states have their own national guards. Hitler served technically not in the German army, but in the Bavarian army, which was attached to the national German army. So every state in Germany, Hesse, Brandenburg, Prussia, all have their own local militias like the National Guards. They have often their own police forces, kind of like the OPP here, or New York State Police and so forth. So there is this kind of almost sovereign state structure that later Hitler will destroy. But that too is an element in how politics are varying in different parts of Germany depending upon what state you happen to find yourself in. In February, as all this is happening, and in fact, Hitler will he'll write. He says that prison chaplain is telling him what's going on in Germany. Hitler will write in Mein Kampf, quote, "I could stand it no more. It was impossible to stay any longer. While everything went black before my eyes, stumbling, I groped my way back to the dormitory, threw myself on the cot, and buried my burning head in the covers and pillows. I had not wept since the day I had stood at the grave of my mother." And so Hitler is swearing revenge for everything that is occurring. In the meantime, in February of 1919, the provisional government now meets in Weimar, a suburb of Berlin, because there's too much fighting going on inside of Berlin. They don't feel safe. And in this opera house at Weimar, they introduce a new constitution to Germany, which will become known as the Weimar Constitution. It will be described as the most democratic constitution in Europe at that time. Some will describe it as perfectly democratic, and it's going to be key to Hitler's strategy eventually of how he will seize these kinds of dictatorial powers that he will rise to. The particular part of the Constitution that is going to be relevant is Article 48. Article 48 will define the role of the head of state. Prior, of course, it was the Kaiser in the monarchy, but now Germany will be no longer a monarchy, but a republic. And therefore, the monarch is replaced by a president who will be elected for a period of 7 years by a simple majority. It's the president who will appoint a chancellor from the political party that seems to have either the majority of votes or is capable of putting together a coalition, if it's a minority party, to lead the government. So very much the president of Germany will have the same function as the governor general does here in, of course, Canada, which still is a monarchy. The crown remains the sovereign in Canada, as opposed to the people in Germany under the Weimar Constitution. But nonetheless, the president will appoint the chancellor or prime minister from elected politicians. It's a perfect representative democracy in that every 60,000 votes will get one seat for the political party getting those votes in the Reichstag. And of course, nowhere in the history of the Weimar Republic will any one party ever have a majority. It will be always minority governments, which is what exactly the defect of perfect representative democracy involves. If anybody who gets 60,000 votes gets a seat, obviously it's going to be tough getting a majority. And we'll see everybody will at least get one seat in the Reichstag. The president also has so-called Article 48 powers to, in the case of emergency, or if the Reichstag fails to arrive at a consensus, the president has the power to proclaim decrees. And nominally they are supposed to be kind of emergency decrees, but we'll see again as the Reichstag begins to get stalled in a later period, we will see that German presidents will now resort to proclaiming emergency decrees at the behest of a chancellor who will be asking for them, who's failing to get his agenda through the Reichstag. That is exactly the door through which Hitler and the Nazis will later march in 1933 to on their path to seizing power. There's some reform in the voting system as well. German voting rights until 1918 were based on income tax. And so the more tax you paid, the more votes you got. In Imperial Germany, the votes of 3.5% of the population of the richest, 12% of the kind of upper middle classes, and 84.5% of the rest of the population had equal weight. So Germany was actually controlled by the aristocracy and the military. As I say, the old Junkers had a presence on the German general staff, and the upper middle class, while 84.5% of the population, had one vote compared to what they did. So all this is reformed now. Everybody's vote is equal. And that too will open a lot of opportunities for the Nazi Party. So here you can see a chart of all the elections starting January 1919 through to March 1933. And that last March 1933 election, of course, is already under Hitler. It's not a free election anymore, as by then communists are all in concentration camps. But you can see how nobody formed a majority. And you can also see how the Nazis are hardly a presence um, until after 1930. The most they will get is in 1924, 32 seats, and we'll see their popularity actually falls 14 seats, 12 seats. And so this is kind of an interesting period in the history of the Nazi Party. And I'll take you through that period as well and what Hitler is doing in that period. So Ebert will be the first president of the Weimar Republic after February, once it's formed. And it's, of course, very shortly after that that the Paris Peace Conference and the Versailles Conference imposes the kind of treaty terms on Germany. Germany is not allowed to participate in the conference. Neither is the Soviet Union, because they're now a rogue state. So essentially, it's France, Britain, and the United States that will dictate the final peace. And in the spring of 1919, the treaty is now presented to the Germans, and they're told, sign here on the dotted line. There's kind of a blank check attached to it for the reparations that they will pay, although the number won't be calculated until a year later, and it's an extraordinary number. I think something like $230 billion that Germany will never, well, I don't want to say never, it will only end up settling that account in the 2000s. Finalizing the unification of Germany, but it's an extraordinary number that at the time the Germans will not be able to pay, and will actually lead to conditions favorable to the rise of Nazism in Germany. But the terms of this treaty, first of all, completely dismember the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Germany. This is what Europe becomes afterwards. Germany loses a substantial amount of natural reserves and its population. Austro-Hungary is just completely partitioned. Austria kind of becomes this little rump state. Hungary becomes an independent country. Czechoslovakia is carved out of the northern territories of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Pieces of it go to Poland. Big parts of Imperial Russia are returned to Poland. Poland had, of course, lost this territory back in the late 1700s to the Prussians and Russians and Austrians who had destroyed Poland back then. So Poland essentially is recreated. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania now become sovereign states. They're no longer under the rule of the Russian Empire. Romania is expanded in territories. Yugoslavia, although it's not created by the Versailles Treaty, the Versailles Conference kind of endorses the unification of Croatia, which was under the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Slovenia, Montenegro, and so forth, become now part of Yugoslavia. And there's some territorial shifts as well. I won't get into the details of this. We really don't have time, nor time to discuss how Hitler will undo all this, but this certainly will become a major platform in his campaign for power, the reunification of Germany of the past. And it's a humiliating thing for the Germans. On top of that, the German army, as they say, will be reduced to 100,000 men. German police departments are frozen at the manpower they had at the beginning of the war to ensure that Germany doesn't try to, secretly arm its police forces like the military. So that's frozen as well. The German Air Force is completely banned. The Germans may not have a Luftwaffe, an armed air force. They can have a passenger commercial fleet, but no military aircraft. And of course, German naval powers reduced to just kind of a coast guard and river patrol boats, but the Germans cannot have kind of battleship class or destroyer class vessels, submarines, absolutely not. Armor, absolutely prohibited. Heavy offensive artillery. Germans essentially are left with 100,000 men, as I say, to maintain order inside of Germany and to protect its borders as best as Germany could if it had been under attack with 100,000 men, which is really not a lot. And this kind of humiliation as well sparks even more fighting in the streets of Germany. And so the Freikorps now is really the membership beginning to surge. During this unstable period, in the wake of the Weimar Constitution being adopted, and all these kinds of revolutions occurring in Germany, and particularly in Bavaria, where there will be a successful communist revolution and the communists will seize Bavaria and they will turn Bavaria briefly into a Soviet, the Bavarian Soviet Republic. At this very bloody juncture in German domestic politics, Hitler has by now left the hospital. He's been discharged from the hospital, but is one of the 100,000 men who remains in the German army. He becomes a professional soldier in what the German army becomes known at that point, the Reichswehr. And he's still a corporal, but he finds himself back at his Bavarian regiment in Munich under this communist Bavarian government, which has seized control as well of the Bavarian National Guard and, of course, the List regiment in which Hitler serves. And this is where Hitler will actually run for his first kind of electoral public office under the communist Bavarian government. They allow every regiment to elect representatives of the regiment who will kind of liaison with the Soviet government in terms of military policies and soldiering, just like you had soldiers in the Soviets in Russia. And so Hitler is now elected to this position. And in fact, when the Bavarian government is overthrown, at one point, the Freikorps take Hitler and they put him to the wall and are about to execute him as a communist functionary. And somebody rescues Hitler because what Hitler does is quite clever. He is elected, but what he advises to his fellow soldiers in the regiment is that they should not resist the Soviet government in Bavaria, but they should not totally as well collaborate with it. So drag your feet, don't respond quickly to orders from the communist Bavarian leadership. Bide your time. The federal German army and the Freikorps are on their way. They will rescue us. But don't resist yet. Wait till federal German troops under the command of Berlin will arrive and put down the Bavarian Republic. And that's precisely what happened. And so Hitler is actually commended on his wise management under that communist era in Bavaria. And he's now given a number of functions. One of them is to give speeches. He's already, I guess, as when he campaigned for that position in his regiment, he's already recognized as an able speaker. And so it's Hitler's job now to speak to new recruits on the loyalty of a German soldier no longer being vested in the Kaiser, but now in the Weimar Constitution. And here we're going to have in this period the earliest statement from Hitler on his position on Judaism and Jews in Germany that we have recorded, at least on paper. And there's a letter from a German officer to Hitler stating that many of his troops feel that it's communists and Jews, and of course, communist and Jew will become interchangeable in the coming years, that communists and Jews have stabbed Germany in the back in November of 1918. And the stab in the back will, of course, become a theme in not only Nazi politics, but in the general political climate of Germany in the future. And what should he tell his men? And Hitler writes back that this is where we get that statement on scientific anti-Semitism. Hitler writes back that this really shouldn't be at this point in time stressed in speeches and indoctrination speeches to soldiers, because it may trigger kind of a violent reaction toward Jews. And Hitler says that pogroms and these kind of uncontrolled violent outbursts against the Jews of Germany will not solve anything. For a final solution, Hitler says we're going to need a more cold and scientific anti-Semitism. And that's precisely what we're going to see the Nazis bring to Germany, a cold and scientific, gas chamber scientific type of anti-Semitism. So the other thing Hitler is doing, he's also working in the German military intelligence section of his regiment as an intelligence operative and spy, in fact. He is assessing for the intelligence department various political movements that are breaking out throughout Germany, and particularly in Bavaria. And one day, somewhere in September, his commanding officer calls Hitler into his office and says, we have this group in Munich called the DAP, the Deutsche Arbeiterpartei, the German Workers' Party. They sound like a bunch of communists, the Workers' Party. Go take a look. Go to one of their meetings and report back on what you hear, what you see, who is there, what's going on. And Hitler notes that this Workers' Party is using a swastika as one of its symbols. There are many symbols, but the swastika is one. And of course, this is a very ancient symbol that becomes very popular, of course, by the 20th century. You're actually looking at the Windsor hockey team. The swastikas are certainly in Canada. The swastika was a sign of good luck, and a lot of hockey teams wore it out on the ice, including female hockey teams. Here, I think you have the Edmonton women's hockey team. And not just in hockey, but in fashion in the 1920s, in the promotion of various products. Here you can see in the middle, imperial swastika whiskey. You had, swastika crackers, soda crackers, swastika tobacco. You had the Swastika Drug Company in Swastika, Ontario. And you can see during the Second World War, of course, once we go to war, they're advertising, Hitler be damned. This is our sign since 1922. So the Nazis certainly didn't invent the swastika, nor were they the first to adopt it. Swastika, Ontario, kind of up in the north. I'm sure it's a wonderful holiday destination, but it retains its name. There are lots of debates about renaming Swastika, Ontario, but certainly swastikans remain loyal to the original name. Hitler be damned, we came before. Indeed. Coca-Cola often used the swastika as well to market its soft drink. Here you can see kind of a swastika keychain from Coca-Cola. It's a sign that is ubiquitous in human civilization. Almost every continent, we will find traces of the use of the swastika. And essentially, the swastika represents the sun, one of the earliest gods that people worshipped. And so the swastika is representative of the transition of the sun from dawn to sunset, and a kind of daily rebirth of the sun. So it has all sorts of meanings in very many religions, and particularly Buddhism and Hinduism. And to this day, there's this kind of movement to redeem the swastika from the kind of evil symbol it had been reduced to in the 12 years that Hitler was in power, that the Third Reich was in power, which tells us a lot just about the power of this particular dictator to take this thousands and thousands of years old symbol from prehistoric eras, and within 12 years suddenly completely cover it in evil that, today you say you go in on the building with a spray can and you vandalize the walls with graffiti, that's vandalism. But if you spray a swastika in amongst that graffiti, it becomes a hate crime. And so just the power of that symbol expressed with a spray can in the criminal code itself. And in Germany today, of course, it's absolutely prohibited to show the swastika and other symbols that I'll introduce you to that are related to Hitler's Nazi party. So this is an ancient thing that is going to get demonized by the Nazis into this. And Hitler will design this flag The red, of course, is for the purity. The red is for German blood. The white is for the purity of that blood. And of course, the swastika is the sign under which the German race or the Aryan race, there's no such thing as an Aryan race, by the way, although the Germans will invent a false racial history. There is an Aryan language group that is spoken in northern India, in Persia, Iran. It's kind of related to Farsi, the Aryan language, but there is no such thing as an Aryan race. That's a complete invention of Nazi scientists. I put that term scientists in quotation marks, quack scientists. But this, of course, will be the banner that, as I say, Hitler, the failed artist, designs. It's probably nothing worse than a frustrated artist getting his hands on political power. So Hitler attends this first meeting, and very quickly he realizes that these guys are not Nazis at all. But there's something else, the DAP. And Hitler's about to leave, actually, when one of the speakers makes a comment how German states should all go their separate ways rather than attempting to unify, that Bavaria has its own culture that's different from Prussia, kind of in the way Quebec is different from Ontario in very similar ways, Bavaria being predominantly Catholic, Prussia being predominantly Protestant. It has the same kind of cultural differences that Quebec and Ontario have, with, Quebecers being more easygoing. You can buy a wine in a 7-Eleven, alcohol, beer. They're more into arts. And the same applies to Bavarians. They're kind of more easygoing, more into the arts, while the Prussians, like Ontarians, are all about making money and making war. In fact, Churchill will comment how essentially the problem with Nazi Germany is not all the other states of Germany like Hanover or Württemberg or Bavaria, but it's the Prussians. He'll say that the Prussians need to be separated. So indeed, that's as well an aspect of the kind of political culture of the Nazi Party. It is a Bavarian movement, interestingly enough. So when Hitler hears this speech about separation, he gets very angry because he, of course, believes that Germany should not only unite tighter its various states, but also absorb German-speaking Austria as well into what will become known as Großdeutschland, Greater Germany. And regions of Czechoslovakia where there are German-speaking ethnicities and so forth. That'll become his agenda. In any regards, Hitler just jumps up and begins this very skilled speech, haranguing the speaker and actually forcing him to get off the step away from the podium and yield to Hitler. And so once the meeting is over, the senior membership of the DAP now approaches Hitler and invites him to join the Nazi Party, it's not yet called the Nazi Party, the DAP, the Workers' Party. And so they, in fact, even offer him a position on the party leadership executive. That's how impressed they are. And so Hitler now joins the DAP, perhaps as an undercover agent for German military intelligence. Perhaps he is co-opted into the party because he believes in its ideology, becomes a follower. We know that around January 1920, somewhere in there, as Hitler begins his rise in the Nazi Party, he will officially resign from the German army. He'll leave military service. And so how long Hitler was working against the DAP, it's unclear. At one point, he actually became a functioning member of the party rather than spying on it. But here you can see what Nazi propaganda will present as his party card in the DAP, Deutsche Arbeiterpartei. You can see he's given number 7, but that he's the 7th member of the party. The founder was, by the way, a man called Anton Drexler. In fact, Hitler might not have been the 7th member. He might have been actually the 55th member, because the original party card was number 555. But they began with the number 500 to make it seem like there were more of them. So historically, we believe that Hitler was the 55th member of what will become later the Nazi Party. Behind the DAP is an extensively, deeply rooted secret society called the Thule-Gesellschaft, the Thule Society. This society, it's an anti-Semitic society. It uses the swastika as one of its symbols, the rolling swastika. It has these, you see those curved edges, and so it's more representative of the sun. It's described as a Völkische party. Völkische, the term folk means kind of like folk in English, like folklore, folk music, but there's a profounder meaning to the German use of folk. It's almost like a spiritual description of the German people. The Völkische movement will describe race as a kind of a manifestation of the collective soul of the people. So there is this kind of esoteric, supernatural aspect to what the concept of the German race will be. And that's very, very critical to everything that Hitler will do and what the Nazi Party will do. And I'll dig deeper here into this, because when we try to understand what Hitler as a dictator certainly represents, he does represent this folkish ideology that the Thule Society has been promoting. And the Thule Society is financed by the Junkers, by German financial interests, by executives, owners of some of the major German corporations, who all fear that the German working class is being lured into the communist movement. And so the Thule Society starts financing non-communist workers' parties. And certainly the Thule Society is deeply anti-Semitic, because they, of course, exclude Jews from being able to be part of the German folk. And the emancipation of Jews in the post-Napoleonic era is actually the beginning of the German quest to define what is German. Because, of course, many German Jews, particularly those living in cities, often assimilate. Many of them abandon the practices of Judaism and either become atheists or even convert to Christianity in some cases. And so this assimilation of Jews among Germans is what actually gives rise to a kind of a new racial ideology that, Germans are something more than just individuals living in Germany who have adopted Protestantism or Catholicism, that there has to be something deeper in the blood. Racial blood becomes key. Very much a different thing from anti-Semitism in the previous eras, where all a Jew was expected to do was recognize Christ and convert to Christianity, and they were adopted into Christian society as an equal member. The notion was, of course, you're kind of a Jew by choice, a choice that you can undo. That will not be so under Hitler's new regime. You will be defined under Nazi law. A Jew is someone whose grandparents were Jews. And so even if your parents had, converted to Catholicism and you were raised as a Catholic, you could be a bishop in the Catholic Church, but under German law, you would have been classified as a Jew by virtue of who your grandparents were, of what who your descendants was, your genealogical lineage. So the Thule society again uses this ancient symbol as a symbol of German racial purity, and Hitler will adopt that to his future propaganda. But the Thule society, of course, gives us that context to the new use of the swastika, and does to this day, although the Thule society doesn't exist as far as we know. It kind of, once Hitler takes power, it will vanish and leave behind only the Nazi party. But there's other symbols they use that are also prohibited in Germany today under federal law. One of them is the symbol of the black sun. Here you see a version of it. This idea that we're actually in a kind of elliptical orbit rather than a circular orbit around two suns, one that is burnt out and is black and we don't see it, while the other one is visible to us, the glowing sun. And this kind of, again, is this duality that we see in many religions. Yin and yang duality is the same thing that these folkish societies proclaim, and the Thule society certainly would have propagated. Here's another. This is the most popular version of the black sun symbol. And Himmler, of course, will be one of Hitler's 3 or 4 most powerful minions inside of Germany. Hitler's dictatorship is unique that it fuels, almost like a franchise, all these individual mini dictators under Hitler that will be carrying out, like I say, really like franchises, carrying out some of the things in their own way, their own interpretations. Hitler will become almost like this vessel. The term Ian Kershaw will use, working toward Hitler, and I'll talk about that a little bit further down here in this lecture. But Himmler, of course, is the head of the SS, and he'll run the entire German security policing system, the concentration camps, the military arm, the Holocaust, the kind of genocidal murder of other peoples, the Poles, the Serbs, the Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, and all this will be done by Himmler, and as well, kind of the supernatural expression of Thule society's mythology of the folk, the people, the kind of mystical notions of the black sun and the swastika and runic magic and so forth. Here's Himmler at an inspection of a concentration camp. Himmler will imagine himself kind of as a Teutonic knight. They'll choose the black uniform, a Jesuit black signifying purity. That's why sort of like priests often wear black. Purity can be all colors, white, or the total absence of color, black. And so that's why Himmler will choose the color black as the ceremonial uniform for the SS, signifying racial purity. And he'll sequester this castle in southern Germany, Wewelsburg, where this will kind of become the Camelot for the Nazi party, and particularly for the SS, for all their occult rituals. There's a good book on the Wewelsburg Castle, the ideological center for the SS, called Heinrich Himmler's Camelot, Stephen Cook, Stuart Russell. A number of books have been written about Wewelsburg and its function in Nazi Germany as kind of, this is where the knights of the Nazi Round Table would gather. And we're not clear about exactly what the rituals were that were carried out at Wewelsburg. In the center, there still is, the castle still stands. It's a museum now. There still stands the round room where some of these rituals were carried out, with the podium still there. But whatever it was that stood there in the center, it's unclear. There's just empty spot there. And as we're kind of these podiums where something was displayed there, they just stand there empty as well. Never saw a photograph from the Nazi era of exactly what was in that ritual room. If you look up at the ceiling, you can see again a kind of a black sun with a swastika motif at its center, overlooking that centerpiece. And you see the black sun as well, incorporated by Nazi architects who renovated this castle as a symbol there. And this sign, as I say, that's prohibited in Germany, you will see it worn by neo-Nazis. And if you don't know what you're looking at, you don't know you're looking at neo-Nazis. Many of them hide under different guises. They know that the swastika is a provocative image and will use that swastika today to kind of provoke. But as well as they move through society, they hide themselves behind other symbols that only they know what they mean. Very few people will realize that the black sun is a Nazi symbol or used by neo-Nazis today, among many other symbols, not just the black sun. You can see it. It's often neo-Nazis will have it tattooed on their body. Other symbols, of course, are hidden away. For example, the most recent neo-Nazi movement in Canada are the Soldiers of Odin, the SOO, protecting our citizens. They claim that their concern is about dangerous immigrants entering Canada, but of course, at the heart of their agenda are neo-Nazi racial agendas, and they're spread out throughout Canada. the soldiers of Odin. They often disguise themselves as community groups. Here is the Fraser Valley Soldiers of Odin, who have charity events, community services, join the Soldiers of Odin, and I'm going there because the Thule Society was kind of like this. It wasn't clear what exactly or who they actually were, and the Thule Society, essentially its sponsorship of the DAP and its outgrowth of the Nazi Party is only one movement of many that they had sponsored. And so these kind of anamorphous groups emerge as a Nazi party, in our history, without realizing that it's not as simple as somebody with a Hitler mustache and the swastika. It's a lot more deep and complex, the roots of these kinds of movements. Hitler essentially will be the first to emerge as this kind of dictator. Here you can see the soldiers of Odin actually have some of their meetings in Edmonton's Legion halls, although I think once the Legion was kind of alerted to the exact nature of the soldiers of Odin, the Canadian Legion has since then banned them. But they're everywhere throughout Canada and growing. It's the new flavor of neo-Nazism. Here you can see the Quebec branch of the Soldiers of Odin. They just use the black sun on their symbols with the fleur-de-lis. And certainly neo-Nazism, particularly racial neo-Nazism, has deep roots in Quebec, where Quebecois themselves feel oppressed as a race by kind of the Protestant ascendancy in the past, and so with racial movements, there's a tendency of shit flowing downwards. If the Quebecois feel racially oppressed in their history, and so in kind of the proclamation of their rights, they tend to now step down on others, and that is typical of kind of the process often. So the black sun, as I say, is only one of the symbols. This is the room actually here, where you can see this knights of the round table being gathered by Himmler. He's literally giving them swords as well. Was one of the award. You would get this kind of knightly sword if you were distinguished in the SS. All the marriage rituals will become paganized. One of the things, again, I keep referring to the future. I'll look further in the lecture, just Hitler's rejection as well of Judeo-Christian values and Christianity. Period. Right. Eventually, it was the intention of Hitler to make Christianity extinct in Germany. He wasn't going to suppress it, but he's going to discourage it. And those who joined the racial elite of Nazi Germany, the SS, they first of all, they had to prove the purity of their race going back to 1750. And record keeping in Germany and the German states was fairly extensive, that this was not all that difficult. As well, they're encouraged when joining the SS to renounce their Catholic or Protestant religion and identify themselves as, quote, believers. And it's not clear what they believed in, but it was kind of a paganistic belief in the German race, in the folk. And marriage rituals are paganized. This is kind of like what a baptismal altar looks like. Babies here, you can see, are baptized in the name of Hitler and the people. Deutschland erwacht. There's that slogan, Germany awake, right there on the banner. And in fact, if you look here, you can see the groom has a book in his hand, and that's the marriage edition of Mein Kampf. When you graduated in school in Germany, you'd get a Mein Kampf. When you married, you got a marriage edition of Mein Kampf. It becomes the Holy Bible, essentially, of Nazi Germany, Hitler's autobiographical book. Christmas, you're looking, Christmas will not be celebrated. Yuletide will be the pagan um, festival of the winter solstice, Yuletide, which is in fact where we get Christmas. When under Constantine, we kind of fixed Christmas Day around December 22nd, which is the winter solstice. It's not a coincidence that Christmas is chosen at that time, and so Germans in the SS, as I say, these are concentration camp guards celebrating Christmas. They're celebrating Yuletide, and on the table there you can see the kind of Eulaker right there. This was made by concentration camp prisoners at that time, and a candle would be inserted into it, and that's also where the Christmas tree is part of that ritual as well. These are pagan festivals that once pagans are converted to Christianity, particularly again in Rome under Constantine, you begin to see this merging of pagan religious motifs and beliefs with Christianity. And the swastika, of course, it's not a coincidence that Christians commemorate, the Sabbath day is Sunday. As I say, that's not a coincidence at all. Certainly Christians until Constantine, the Sabbath day was Saturday, but it's moved to Sunday in honor of the god of Rome. At that point, the kind of senior god was Sol Invictus, the victorious sun. And Constantine really never converted to Christianity until his deathbed. He remained the Pontificus Maximus of Sol Invictus, of the cult of the victorious sun, to his death. Christianity, he only converts to Christianity without rejecting the sun god as kind of insurance on his deathbed. So all these things remain in our Western culture to this day, as they say, Sunday and our Christmas celebrations around Yuletide, all these things are incorporated. And so the Nazis will begin reverse engineering these early pagan roots in Christianity, stripping away the kind of Christian additions to these early religions and returning Germans back to their pagan roots. That's Hitler's ambition. That becomes the ideology of that state. Runic magic as well, Nordic magic, the use of these various symbols will be taught in the SS. It will be used not only by the SS, by the German army as well, as kind of regimental symbols. Every one of these symbols can be combined together into a kind of system of runic incantations, including in the battle, on the battlefield as well, in the concentration camps, in military depots, and so forth. And Hitler, of course, will become as well a practitioner of runic symbology. And each one has a particular meaning. That S, lightning S, is actually the Sieg rune, the victory rune. It's kind of misspelled here. I guess maybe it's phonetically expressed, the Sieg rune. But the SS wear it, the double S. It's almost a coincidence that the double S, Schutzstaffel, special protection units. Some graphic artist will express them in kind of the runic symbol for victory. SS becomes this double sign. Here again, Son, Sonnen. Son is the German word for sun, the rolling swastika as we describe it in English. The life rune, the death rune, the tear rune is the rune of the warrior. The Odal rune is the rune for ancestry, respect of one's ancestors, and so forth. So here you can see the SS, they weren't buried under Christian graves. They will be buried under these runic symbols. Here you can see the life rune combined with the spear on top, the the warrior rune. And then here where you look at where it says the date of birth and the date of death, the life rune again, 1921, the death rune, 1942. So this is what SS graves would look like, kind of a combination of those runes. See here, he's wearing the double SS Sieg rune on his tunic. The death's head as well symbolized fidelity unto death, a old Prussian military symbol. You'll see long before the Nazis, Prussian officers wearing a large death's head in their helmet or their kind of fur cap. It's so ingrained in Nazi society that even typewriters above the letter 5 will have a dedicated double S rune to use rather than spelling out SS in kind of English figures or anglicized figures or Germanicized alphabet. There is a special S type set. So when you see German documents, the SS, it has its own right there, you can see it, its own type set that it has those lightning flashes. That's how deep, again, this kind of runic symbology will be incorporated. All of us have seen, of course, I imagine, Steven Spielberg's Raiders of the Lost Ark, these kind of Nazi archaeological expeditions that are the themes in his movies, Raiders of the Lost Ark. They're actually the Raiders of the Lost Ark, those kind of archaeologists did exist. Here are the real Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Ahnenerbe, the ancestral society, which had archaeologists going out throughout the world searching for early traces of the German race. And according to Nazi mythology, the Germans were giants at one time living in the Himalayan mountains. And so there are all these SS Nazi expeditions out to Tibet to search down the origins of the Germans. Real kooky science. Here you can see they're measuring German Ahnenerbe scientists measuring local Tibetans for their Germanic qualities. And of course, they'll be collecting heads of other races as well for museums of the people. That's one of the function of the Ahnenerbe is to preserve races that the Nazis will actually be killing out, so that Nazi school teachers can bring kids to the school and point out the way, our kids would be brought to the Royal Ontario Museum to look behind glass at remnants of, other species of hominids, Neanderthal man and so forth. Nazi kids would be brought in there, and that's what a Jew looked like. That's what a Pole looked like. I'm sure the kids wouldn't have been told that they were all massacred by the Nazis. They would be told, but they were racially inferior, and they kind of vanished. The way Neanderthal people did. And of course, we probably slaughtered the Neanderthals in the same way that the Germans were planning to slaughter the Poles, the Russians, the Jews, and other peoples that were not part of the Volk. Is the SS Annenarbe. Their symbol, again, is a combination of the Hagel rune. Here you can see an Annenarbe ring worn by members of that association. And on side, they have the holy tree of German paganism. Right there, that symbol there. This was the stem on publications published by the Annenarbe, and its offices often had that symbol. It's representative of a holy tree that Charlemagne chops down in his forcible conversion of German pagans to Christianity around the year something like 500, 600. I'm getting fuzzy on that era of history, but certainly early in our history, the conversion of German pagans to Christianity. It was done by the sword. So that's symbolic of that tree, and you'll see it in Nazi regalia. Here's at Annenarbe headquarters. You can see this tapestry with this tree worked in as well. Here, again, the Hagel rune right there, symbolizing respect of the ancestry of your people. The rolling swastika combined with the pagan tree, and the inscription Blutenboden, blood and earth. That's a term that will be coined by one of Hitler's ideologists, Alfred Rosenberg. Blood and earth, and again, I'll get into that in a couple of minutes. Here you can see an SS member of the Annenarbe, again with the Hagel rune there. And you see it too in Nazi tattoos today. Neo-Nazi males tend to be very kind of peacock exuberant in their tattoos. I don't have a lot of respect for I have no respect for Nazis. I think they're, neo-Nazis are a bunch of louts, and the neo-Nazi women are often the ones who have to go to work and support their neo-Nazi mates and the children that they're bringing up as neo-Nazis, and so you'll often see women who have to work and be more integrated into society who are members of neo-Nazi cults. They have a very sometimes subtle, almost indistinct tattoo, as you can see here. Otherwise, you would not know that they were neo-Nazis, and so they mark themselves, as I say, with a much more discreet tattoo. And often it's the Hagel rune, which is a very, very, as I say, simple rune that to an untrained eye they would not, is not recognizable as a Nazi symbol at all. But it is as profoundly Nazi as the swastika. You'll see it often in among Nazi graffiti. So it is a ubiquitous and often used alternative way of Nazis identifying each other and themselves. The master of one of the grand masters of the Thule Society was Dietrich Eckart, a German poet and journalist. We could say a failed poet. We're going to see how many failed artists there are in the Nazi Party. Um, Dietrich Eckart will take Hitler under his wing. And in fact, he will groom him in public speaking. Dietrich Eckart will as well introduce Hitler to higher ranking members of German society, like Erich Ludendorff, for example, the ex-field marshal who had resigned at the end of the war. Those Junkers would never have spoken to a ex-corporal, kind of even lower than working class. Hitler was destitute, not even a worker. So, and corporal, the low, the second lowest rank in the military. So someone like Field Marshal Ludendorff wouldn't even look his way. It's Dietrich Eckart who will introduce Hitler to higher society. And in fact, it's Dietrich Eckart that takes Hitler for the first time to Berlin. As well, he takes Hitler on vacations to the Obersalzberg, where Hitler will build his kind of palatial lodge and his home up in the mountains, which will be called the Eagle's Nest, although that's not exactly accurate. The Eagle's Nest will be a tea house built up high in the mountain there as a gift for him for his birthday, but it will be known as the Berghof, the mountain farm or the mountain house. Hitler as well will dedicate the second volume of Mein Kampf. It was published in 2 volumes. The second volume of Mein Kampf is also dedicated to Dietrich Eckart. It's Dietrich Eckart who's going to coach Hitler, refining his speaking abilities as well. He's going to ideologically coach Hitler. Mein Kampf Volume 2, by the way, is dedicated to the 16 Nazis who died during the beer hall putsch, the martyrs of the Nazi Revolution, as they'll become known. But Volume 2 is for Dietrich Eckart. Here he is, actually, Hitler at the Obersalzberg. And one thing you'll know about the Nazis is their love for the environment, for animals. And that has to do partly with the notion of what the folk is. The idea of folk is beyond just people. It's as well nature, trees, grass, the animals, all these things represent a collective soul, collective German soul, race as a manifestation of the soul. And of course, Jews are regarded as a cancer on that soul. And partly the Holocaust, and not only killing of the Jews, but of other races as well, will be seen as kind of an environmental measure to protect the collective German soul. Goering, for example, he kept lions. So they're huge. I'll show you a few laws shortly as well. The Nazis will be one of the greenest parties ever come to power. And animal rights advocates today would die for the kind of animal protection laws that the Nazis pass. And it's not just kind of that Nazis have sympathy for animals. They see animals again as being kind of the collective soul of racial purity. The ancient manuscript Germania by the Roman historian Tacitus, written around 98, the year 98 AD is critical to Nazis' understanding of who the German people are. Tacitus, of course, is describing tribes that had gone to war with the Roman Empire in the beginning of the new millennium, at the time of Augustus, and he describes in this manuscript Germania the Germans as being, first of all, racially pure, that they don't intermix with other races, that they have blue eyes, and Tacitus describes them as having red hair. That their chiefs, die with the warriors, that they're very honorable. And of course, this is a Roman writing about his enemy. And so the Nazis just wet themselves over the manuscript. They try the Italians. Actually, Mussolini has possession of one of the earliest surviving accurate transcriptions of the manuscript, of Tacitus's manuscript, and Hitler will try to get Mussolini to give it to Germany as a gift, and Mussolini will resist, and Germans will try to take it by force. They'll hide the manuscript, so it now belongs to the Italian state, but it was, in the Nazi period, a manuscript that was held by a family of aristocrats in Italy who had possessed it since the Renaissance era, when manuscript collection was kind of a fad. Christopher Krebs describes it as the most dangerous book. Tacitus's Germania from the Roman Empire to the Third Reich. The Nazis will declare Germania as the birth certificate of the German people. And of course, this era, although Tacitus doesn't describe it, but this era sees this clash between the German tribes led by a tribal warrior by the name of Arminius against three legions that are marching through northern Germany from their summer quarters to their winter quarters, and they're ambushed, these legions, and slaughtered. Approximately 20,000 Romans, 15,000 soldiers plus 5,000 camp followers and auxiliaries and so forth, are slaughtered in the forest of Germany by Armenians, and it's a disaster for the Romans. In fact, Augustus is, famously is quoted, Varus, Varus, where are my legions? He loses 3 legions, and a legion is equivalent to an aircraft carrier group today in terms of military power. All right, this is a legion was the most powerful unit of the Roman army, right? And there weren't that many. I think maybe Rome had 36 legions throughout its history, and here the Germans, in a week in September, wipe out 3 of them. And it's only recently, around the 1970s, that we actually discovered the site of the Teutoburg Forest where that battle took place. Nobody knew exactly where it was lost. It was found by a British amateur archaeologist in the 70s. And we now realize what happened when that was the site excavated, how the Germans had kind of camouflaged themselves in the forest, some 7,000 Germans, and constructed a false road that led into a swamp. And the 3 legions that were marching were approximately 3.5 kilometers in length, single file, marching through a narrow forest. And so the tail didn't know what the head was doing. And so as the head gets bogged down in this swamp following a fake road that the Germans build, the back is pushing them into this cluster. Meanwhile, the Germans kind of hide behind these palisades, camouflaged, and begin just slaughtering 20,000 Romans like pigs in the pen, essentially. They massacre all three legions. Varus, in the end, in disgrace, falls on his sword on the battlefield. No one survives. It's, for those of you who've seen the movie Gladiator, that movie hints at the return of a Roman legion to take revenge against the Germans. That's how that movie opens. And so this is a monumental battle in German history. And you often see Arminius portrayed as this winged warrior leading the Germans to victory, not even over the Roman Empire, but it will become interpreted as over Western values, in particular over what will represent later Western Judeo-Christian values. So here you have a 19th century portrayal of Arminius returning, and Hitler will associate himself with Arminius. He is the hero of the German people. Arminius, by the way, his name is later bastardized in German to Hermann. Hermann. Here means army, man means man, army man, military man. Hermann, or as Canadian troops will refer to them in the First World War, Hermann the German. Here it is, again, Arminius Hermann awakening the soul of Germany in repose among these pagan trees. This is a kind of, again, 19th century image. This is during the French occupation of German states under Napoleon, as the Germans are raising again Hermann, Arminius, taking the chains off Germania. And again, you can see these broken standards here at the feet. This represents the defeat of the German, the defeat of the West by the German peoples. It's celebrated, of course, in Wagnerian opera that Hitler so much loved. Götterdämmerung, Twilight of the Gods, is about Arminius in that battle, as many of Wagner's operas are. And as I say, Hitler will just be a huge fan of Wagnerian opera. Here's a Renaissance era of, again, Arminius returning back to the village, and he's carrying all these captured Roman standards with him. And so this is what all this is going to symbolize. Often people mistake this standard that looks like a Roman vellum. This is what this kind of thing is, this device is called. Again, the inscription, Germany awake, Deutschland erwacht, the National Socialist German Workers' Party. And people kind of sometimes interpret this as Germany pretending to be the Roman Empire, that they're as powerful as the Roman Empire. In fact, what they're celebrating in this is their defeat of the West, of Western values as they were represented by Rome at that time. That's what this means. The figure of Arminius, of course, will be key, particularly when the Germans go at war with the West in 1871, the Franco-Prussian War, in celebration of the victory of Germany over France in 1871, is this monument not far from where the Germans thought the Battle of Teutoburg took place, with the figure of Arminius. This is the most visited German tourist site by Germans. And Arminius, of course, is holding his sword and he's looking toward the west. It's not the east that the Germans see as their enemies, it's the west. And this will be very key again to Hitler's ideology, is the Hermann statue at Detmold in northern Germany. And of course, the kind of winged imagery that we see in Wagnerian operas associated with Armenius is carried over into Prussian military uniforms and then into Nazi military ceremonial uniforms. That theme continues right through into Nazi Germany. The idea as well, we have this notion of German warriors, particularly in the Nazi period, as kind of being masters of mechanized warfare. That's a myth. In fact, the German army was the least mechanized of all the armies. The main mode of transport in the German army was horses. They rode on horses. They used horses to transport munitions, to transport wagons, to transport their wounded, and so forth. So, it's a myth that the German army was kind of motorized to the extent that its motorization is often eulogized. What the Germans actually were they were masters of camouflage, going right back. Again, these are Renaissance era etchings of what tribal Germans were supposed to be looked like, and there again, their ability to camouflage themselves in the forest. They're seen as forest warriors, the exact opposite of the Roman warriors who dreaded the forest and found the forest inability to maneuver in the forest for those reasons that essentially Romans mostly fought in southern geography, among kind of scraggly olive trees, the kind of flat territory of Palestine, southern France, and so forth, the Gaelic wars, the forest, the sunny Mediterranean Roman warriors feared the forest. It was dark and gloomy and threatening, but that's where the German warriors thrived in it. They perfectly integrated themselves into the forest as soldiers, and that's precisely how approximately 8,000 Germans destroyed 20,000 Romans, because the Romans could not maneuver on the particular battlefield that the Germans chose. And so the modern German army, what they are distinguished for historically is their ability to camouflage. And battlefield camouflage is actually pioneered by not only the German army, but in fact the Nazi militarized elite, the Waffen SS. It's the Nazi era German army and the SS that develop these smocks, for example, that nobody wore, that reduce casualties, sometimes up to by 40%. Now, ubiquitously, everyone wears in the military these camouflage smocks, but in the Second World War, it was unique to the Waffen SS. Here's the autumn foliage smock. Here's the spring one. The summer one had a different one. And so they were highly evolved. And again, that's really the roots of the German military tradition and its relationship to the past. So the slogan in Hitler's Germany is going to be Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. One people, one Reich, one Führer. And here you can see again the notion of Volks, the Volksgemeinschaft, meant the community of the people. And the Volksgenossen were the members of the community. And Jews, of course, could not be members of the community, no more than Poles could be or other non-Germans. This is kind of an idealized vision of the members of the German community under the protection of the Nazi war eagle, embracing them in its wings. So here are all the different permeations. Volk means people, a Volkische movement, like the Thule Society, the Volksgemeinschaft, the community of the people. Hitler will speak about doing everything he does on behalf of the community of the people, as well the Volksgenossen, members of the community. When Hitler comes to power, he will incorporate all these notions again of the community into his management of Germany. Notably, for example, the construction of the Autobahn, the superhighways that are meant to transport not only ordinary Germans, but as well the military. It's a way of deploying the military, but the Autobahn is built very carefully to incorporate it into the German landscape. No advertising is allowed. There's no unsightly gas stations along the way. It is supposed to be purely fit, like almost parkways, into the German environment. Passages are carved carefully underneath the highway so animals can migrate without risking their lives. And it's, as I say, a kind of environmentally sound new system of superhighways, the first, I think, in the world, long before we have interstates in the United States, the Autobahn. And of course, the people's cars, Volkswagens, are designed to use economically, again, without producing a lot of exhaust and so forth, these tiny economic cars for people to, Germans to be able to transport themselves along these beautiful highways that are, integrated into the natural landscape. Hitler himself actually sketches out the first idea for what a Volkswagen should look like. And he will oversee, if I'm not mistaken, Ferdinand Porsche, the same designer of what will become, the Porsche sports car, is the designer who executes Hitler's design for the Volkswagen. So it does come out of Hitler's mind, the Volkswagen. Germans will be able to buy these cars on the layaway plan. They can have part of their salary deducted until a car is paid for, and then they will be issued the car. Of course, very few Germans manage to cash in on that, because as the war gets progressively more desperate, the Nazis will seize all the Volkswagen funding that Germans lay it away for and use it for military purposes. So they'll never collect actually on their delivery of the of Volkswagens. But the word forks in Volkswagen, of course, has all these kinds of deeper meanings if you're a Nazi, and it's part of this promotion of German, almost kind of holistic, well being, kind of this middle class vision of what Germans in the Third Reich are going to be enjoying, at, of course, the expense of millions of deaths of other people. Here you can see the slogan Kraft durch Freude, calendar. Kraft durch Freude means strength through joy. This was a society as well that encouraged tourism for many Germans who in the 1920s and 30s were broken by the economic situation in Germany and never got to travel and so forth. Now, as Germany is beginning to occupy all these countries, Germans can get very low rate tourist trips to occupied Paris, occupied Amsterdam, and so forth, and presumably be able to drive in their Volkswagen along the Autobahn to visit as tourists conquered countries. There's the 1 millionth Volkswagen to come off the German lines. So, who would have thought the love bug comes out of Hitler's imagination? Right down to its last kind of pink version. It's and that symbol as well. It looks almost runic, and in fact, some neo Nazis have adopted the Volkswagen sign as well in their tattooed art. Finally, here you can see all the laws that Nazis introduce immediately coming into power from 1933, from the laws on the slaughter of animals, on how much light and air will be allocated to farm animals, orders on plants, animal breeding, and so forth. I don't think we have the time to get into each law, but you could certainly, pause the tape and go through these laws yourselves. You see, there's 2 pages of them. With the final animal rights law that the Nazis will introduce in February of 1942, a decree prohibiting Jews from keeping pets. So they're actually going to protect animals from Jews. That's how crazy the Nazis have gotten over the issue again of animal protection laws. And again, Jews are seen as kind of an environmental threat. In fact, sexual relations between a German and a Jew will be called race pollution, Rassenschande. And even that has a kind of an ecological term to it, racial pollution. And even in the Nazi kind of hierarchy of races, there's such a thing, as you can see from this illustration here. Sorry. There's such a thing as a Jewish dog. Right there. It's kind of a mongrel dog. So the kind of racial classification extends to even animals in the Third Reich. So all these various deep roots that I have spent probably over an hour now describing to you are going to manifest themselves in the Nazi Party. The best book on this, I think, is the first book written about who the Nazis actually are in the kind of spectrum of civilizations and ideologies. It's written by Peter Varick, who is a graduate history student at Harvard, writing about kind of the cultural history of Germany. He's actually in Nazi Germany in the late 30s, observing with his own eyes what is um, occurring there. And so he then defends his thesis in 1940 at Harvard. The thesis is published as Metapolitics, the Roots of the Nazi Mind, published in 1940, a year before the US goes to war with Nazi Germany. And so it's an interesting thesis that is depoliticized when you read it from everything that we will learn about the Nazis as we go to war with them. Certainly, Canada is already at war with Hitler by this period, as is England and obviously France. But the United States won't enter the war until December of 1941. And so this is kind of a depoliticized thesis. It's a rare book now. It had been republished in the 1960s as a paperback. You're looking at that cover. You sometimes can find it was printed quite a lot of copies, so it's certainly not all that difficult to find on the website for used books, Metapolitics and the Roots of the Nazi Mind. Peter Varick argues that what the Nazis represent is the fifth revolt of the German people against the West, against the precepts of Western civilization, that the Nazis are sort of a counter civilization. And of course, if we look at the kind of three pillars of Western civilization, Judeo-Christian values that come from the Jews originally, democracy that we inherit from the Greeks, and justice that we inherit from the Romans. We certainly see that the Third Reich will reject all three: Judeo-Christian values, democracy, and justice. They will pervert all three. And so Varick's argument that Nazi Germany is the fifth revolt is an interesting one. And I'll just quickly summarize for you the five revolts that Varick identifies. One, of course, is the revolt against the Romans by Arminius in the Teutoburg Forest, September 9 CE or AD. He cites the conversion of the pagan Germans in 77-2 by Charlemagne as being the second revolt of the Germans against Western values. Certainly by the year 700, Christianity is no question a value of Western civilization. You have, of course, shortly after that, the founding of what will be referred to as the First Reich. The First, Second, and Third Reich are really terms that are retroactively adopted since the Third Reich. They were, they didn't call themselves that at that time. Anyhow, so this resistance of pagan Germans is the second revolt against the West. Martin Luther's Protestant challenge of Catholicism and the Reformation, again, Varick argues, is the third revolt. It results in the 30-Year War, which is very much a world war. In fact, I would argue the First World War was the 30-Year War, while the Second World War were the Napoleonic Wars, and the First World War was actually the Third World War, while the Second World War was the Fourth World War. So, it's a question of linguistics, actually, or nomenclature, semantics. In any regards, certainly the Protestant revolt against Catholicism in Germany results in the 30-Year War, and then the Peace of Westphalia that partitions the German states and reduces them very much in the same way the Versailles Treaty did. And often Hitler will compare the Peace of Westphalia as a similar humiliation to the Versailles Treaty. And then the fourth revolt against Western values, of course, are the values of the Enlightenment that is brought with the sword by Napoleon. And so you had the wars of independence against the Napoleonic Empire that had absorbed some German principalities. Some, like the Prussians, fought against Napoleon. Others came under Napoleon. And so these wars of independence are key to very many Nazi prototype figures, Führers that emerged in these wars of independence against the French. And of course, they culminate eventually with the war that Bismarck will fight against the French when he's still the Prussian chancellor. And of course, he'll unite Germany into the Second Reich upon the victory of Prussia over France. And so we do get the Second Reich, 1871 to 1918. And then the Weimar Republic. And so Ferrick in 1940 writes that the Third Reich is the German fifth revolt against Western civilization. And Ferrick kind of hopes that it will end the way the other four revolts did. The Germans are defeated, essentially, in all the four previous revolts, as they will be in the fifth revolt against Western civilization. So I think this is perhaps the best understanding we have if we do want to get into metapolitics, as Ferrick called it, and get a deep understanding of who Hitler was. And as I say, Hitler, interestingly enough, as the dictator he is, he's almost a symbol for smaller inner dictatorships that are franchised in Germany. There are a lot of people around Hitler who are going to kind of buttress and fortify his dictatorship into what it's going to become to pursue these various agendas that I had described to you so far. And so I think I'll maybe break the lecture here and do another part where we actually look at what happened, and we've been in very kind of theoretic territory here. I'm going to break the lecture here into another part where we actually look at kind of the secular history of how Hitler now will create his dictatorship and hold it, and what he does and how he does it, as we've been kind of bouncing around here back and forth between the 20th century and the Roman imperial period and all these different periods, as well as ideologies and philosophies. But I think so much of this has been lost that we have this impression of Hitler. We have a very shallow and surface understanding of exactly what he represented, without understanding the currents on which he rolled into power that partly drowned him, but these currents continue flowing. And so what Hitler as a dictator represents is not something that has vanished or disappeared. It lives on in many of these neo-Nazi movements that I had described to you, and in kind of the myths and legends and ideologies and philosophies and theologies of race, and particularly Nordic legend, as you know, the soldiers of Odin, the use of, again, runic symbols that are Nordic in their nature, which Nazi Germans are going to associate themselves with. So I'll break here and catch up to you with another part that will look at the secular rise of Hitler, his dictatorship, and how it comes crashing down around his head.